Hello and welcome to this Philosophy Summer School session on the first book of Plato's Republic. Have you ever heard of the Greek philosophers? Maybe the names Plato and Aristotle ring a bell for you. These ancient philosophers still have a lot to teach us today, because they reflect on the world and the way it is to make observations that carry across time and space. This session will help you to develop your own critical thinking skills so that you too can become a philosopher. Plato's Republic is one of his most famous existing works. We will be having a look at the first book in this session, which talks about justice. First of all, let me tell you a little bit about myself. So for my A-levels, I studied French, Maths and Religious Studies, and I also did Spanish at AS level and an EPQ about Shakespeare. I took religious studies because I was really interested in this particular subject area, and the two components of the course were philosophy and ethics, and this is how I got to know philosophy. And through philosophy of religion, I learnt about Plato and Plato's cave and the form of the good, which you might have recognised. I then went on to study philosophy and French at undergraduate level, and this was at St John's College in Oxford. On my philosophy side, I studied moral philosophy, logic and general philosophy in first year, as this is the generic course for all undergraduate students of philosophy. And then in my second year and fourth years, I studied Aristotle, Aquinas, philosophy of religion, and finally Plato. My options were extremely complementary because Plato influenced Aristotle, then Aristotle heavily influenced St. Thomas Aquinas, and the other medieval philosophers like Maimonides and Averroes, and medieval religious philosophers left a huge imprint on the direction of the philosophy of religion. You can tailor your philosophy options to your own interests if you decide to study this course or another philosophy course at Oxford. I was encouraged to study philosophy at university because I was interested in theology and religion, and philosophy of religion was really, really interesting for me. I also wanted to train myself to be able to think really clearly, to think well. And philosophy trains you how to think, to reflect and to reason. So really it's useful for any field or life choice or career. I also wanted to argue well and to be able to understand, discover truth and defend it, because this is a very important life skill. And my philosophy studies have proven to be very useful. Quickly to talk about the French side of the course, I wanted to study French to improve my communication skills and to learn about literature and linguistics. I also thought it would be useful to become fluent in another language. Furthermore, I wanted to gain knowledge and understanding of other cultures, and this I did acquire. I've gone on to study development studies at the University of Sussex. And my philosophy studies and some of my French has helped me to critically analyse the political, economic and social factors behind the way the world works that I have encountered in development studies. My course as an undergrad has meant that I can write very, very well, very high quality essays. And I'm also now aware of philosophical thought throughout time, which has affected scholars' views and opinions of people over the ages. So now we can have a brief introduction to Plato. Plato was born in around the 400s BCE. He was a pupil of the great philosopher Socrates, who we don't actually know very much about, because most of what we know about Socrates comes through Plato's writings, because Plato used him as a protagonist in many of his own writings. However, we know that Socrates died by execution and that Plato was very upset by this because he very much respected Socrates as a teacher. Plato opened his own school up in Athens called the Academy, which Aristotle then attended as Plato's pupil. So these three great philosophers are very connected, teacher and pupil. The philosophical interaction between Plato and Aristotle is very interesting, because Aristotle has been influenced by Plato, although he disagrees on many of the things that his teacher says. This painting that you can see on screen is from the Vatican City. It is painted by Raphael, and it depicts Plato's Academy in Athens. And on the left, we see a figure in pink and purple pointing up to the sky. This is Plato. Then we see on the right Aristotle, his pupil, in brown and blue, with a book. And traditionally, the fact that Plato is pointing to the sky and Aristotle is pointing forwards and facing down is traditionally understood as being representative of their different foci, because Plato was very transcendent in his thinking, whereas Aristotle was quite grounded, focusing on the way things work in the world around us rather than trying to transcend into a different spiritual reality. Medieval philosophers like Averroes, Maimonides, and Aquinas tended to agree with Aristotle's point of view over Plato's, but they saw Aristotle's work as lacking in divine inspiration. So quite often you see that Aristotle's work has been almost filled in with a divine element that these great philosophers believed was lacking in Aristotle's understanding. As a philosopher, you start to see that many people's thought is linked up across centuries of contemplation, as in the case of Plato and Aristotle with the medieval philosophers into the present day. Plato was very interested in politics, and Republic explores this. So in short, Republic is about how to run a society. It's written in what has come to be known as Socratic dialogue. The term Socratic dialogue actually comes from Plato's writing style, because the protagonist of the dialogue, in the case of Republic, is Socrates, who is modelled on Plato's teacher. The other characters in the dialogue discuss ideas with Socrates throughout, giving their own arguments and counter-arguments to those that Socrates presents. Socrates' arguments are built up slowly, line by line, and each line is usually phrased as a question which asks the interlocutors for approval in terms of the validity of his reasoning. So what often happens is that Socrates gives a dozen lines of reasoning that all sound very acceptable, and then suddenly he draws a conclusion that does validly follow from the premises, but which sounds shocking or counterintuitive and which we may not necessarily have been expecting. In philosophy, a premise is a point that is made in an argument. A valid argument is one where if all the premises are true, so all the points that the philosopher makes is true, then the conclusion must also be true. Republic explores the concept of justice as well, and within this there are other themes on how to instantiate justice. So we hear about how to deal with music and poetry safely, because Plato saw these as having a great impact on a person's soul. We see explorations of the composition of the soul, which Plato believed to be tripartite, so that means in 3 parts. We learn about how to raise children and how to treat people in society, how to structure the societal life. We also think about how to arrange the political institution, and Plato discusses different rankings of the types of constitution. So today we have democracy usually. In Britain, for example, there's a democracy, but Plato was very critical of this. Philosophical interaction with what is right and good is also discussed, including abstraction of the concept of the good, which is the form of the good in Plato's case. So he tries to separate the good out from other things that surround the good in the ordinary world, in the material world, and he tries to analyse it in its own right, or to present it as a concept in its own right, separate from material things. We also learn about how to educate the different types of people in society. So these are the many themes of the Republic. You may have heard before of Plato's analogy or allegory of the cave, and of Plato's form of the good, because these are different concepts used by Plato that people have largely conserved, and they're both explored in Book 7 of Plato's Republic. In the cave analogy, there are prisoners who are tied up at the bottom of the cave, facing the wall, watching shadows which are projected onto the wall in front of them by people who are moving puppets in front of a fire behind these prisoners. And these prisoners believe that all there is to life is watching these shadows that are projected on the wall of the cave, which they don't even realise are shadows. This keeps going on until one day one of the prisoners is released and dragged up the cave. And this prisoner is made to observe the mechanics of how the shadow shapes are cast onto the wall. They're then dragged further up the cave into the outside world. At first, the former prisoner cannot bear to open his eyes, because the light is too painful, but eventually he's able to reflect on the objects all around him, the water and the trees, for example, and then one day he can finally contemplate the very sun itself. Now when he returns to the cave to enlighten his fellow former prisoners, they laugh and they mock him, and they think he's just completely mad. They say that they would kill him if they could get their hands on him. This analogy of the cave reflects the journey of a philosopher who comes to appreciate greater truths than what the others can see. It takes the philosopher a long time to come to appreciate the highest truth for what it is. This truth is the form of the good, represented by the sun in the analogy. Plato believes it to be only available to the most advanced philosophers, who will be able to reflect on this form of the good fully only after a great many years of the appropriate education and training. Philosophers are the ones who make the strongest rulers of society, according to Plato, because they're the only ones that have the true knowledge and understanding that's required to make everything run effectively and for the right reasons. These people are also reluctant to rule, however, because of course they'd rather spend their time reflecting on the form of the good. The prisoner, once he's come out of the cave, doesn't want to go back in. He wants to be out contemplating the form of the good with the higher realities. Plato's Republic discusses a great many ideas in a lot of depth. When we study Plato or any philosopher, the idea is not really just to accept what they say, but rather to observe how they think and argue, and to evaluate whether they're correct. We might find that we agree entirely with Plato on some things, and then completely disagree on other things that he says. And this is fine, but we also need to reflect on our own reasons for agreeing or disagreeing with him. Just saying that, oh, well, everybody knows nowadays that this is right or wrong, or everyone knows that this is true or false nowadays, isn't really enough. Because it's possible that in a few hundred years' time, people will change again their minds, and they'll challenge why we, in the 21st century, blindly accept certain things that they've come to challenge. Philosophers are always engaged in a critical reflection of the way in which they and others think. And this approach is in fact taken by Plato himself within his own work in the first book of his Republic. I'll now give you a bit of an introduction to the first book of Plato's Republic so that we can consider some of the ideas in a bit more depth. So the first book of Plato's Republic discusses the concept of justice. Firstly, Socrates discusses the idea with a guy called Cephalus, who's an old man. Cephalus says that justice is speaking truth and paying what is owed to each person. Then Cephalus leaves. He leaves the scene, and his son Polemarchus carries on Cephalus's arguments when his father leaves. And he says that justice is giving what is owed to each person. Socrates challenges this idea. He asks if Polemarchus' definition still holds if somebody is out of his mind, if he's gone crazy. Should we still give each person what he's technically owed if somebody is about to go and kill someone with a sword that you're about to give back to them, for example? Because Socrates brings up this challenge, Polemarchus edits his argument. And now he says that friends owe it to friends to do them good, and they owe to enemies bad. But Socrates challenges this as well. And he says, well, what happens if somebody is mistaken about who their friends are? Because it can't be right to accidentally do good to a bad person or bad to a good person. So Polemarchus clarifies again, and he says that it's only true friends who are owed good. But Socrates notes that harming people only makes them worse with respect to justice. So we shouldn't, as just people, do injustice to bad people, because this is not going to make them into just people. If a just person is unjust to someone bad, that bad person is not going to become more just as a result. Note how, even at this point in the book 1 of Plato's Republic, we can start to see what's going on philosophically. Socrates is responding to the ideas of his interlocutors by identifying the faults or the holes in their arguments. When he identifies the faults, people respond to him by giving him a more nuanced definition or explanation. But the key that they really need to latch onto is to find a definition that works universally, not only for the particular counterexample that Socrates raises, but for every case. And this is very challenging. Cephalus is not interested in engaging in this type of discussion, so he leaves very quickly. The others in the dialogue, including Polemarchus here, they stay and they engage with Socrates to different extents and in different ways for the remainder of the Republic discussion. Now, once Polemarchus has given his ideas, another character called Thrasymachus interrupts and gives his opinion. Following the discussion with Polemarchus, there's a big debate between Socrates and Thrasymachus. And this arises because Thrasymachus proposes a definition of justice that Socrates disagrees with. So he says that justice is the advantage of the stronger. What Thrasymachus means by this is that justice is to follow the laws made by the strongest people in society, i.e. the rulers, and that these rules are made to the advantage of those people. Socrates does not like this. He notes that rulers sometimes make mistakes. So, for example, it's possible that a ruler could make rules that are not to their advantage. And this would mean that some rules are not advantageous to the stronger, but it's still just for people to follow them. But Thrasymachus argues back that a ruler, insofar as he is a ruler, so a ruler as a ruler, is never mistaken in his judgment as to what is advantageous for himself. But Socrates doesn't like this. He says that craftsmen do not seek their own good, but rather the good of the object of their craft. This means that rulers are not supposed to be seeking their own good by setting rules, but rather the good of the people that they serve. Thrasymachus disagrees with this, and he gives the example of shepherds looking after sheep. He says the reasons that shepherds look after sheep have nothing to do with the fact that the shepherds love the sheep and they want the sheep to do well, and that we need to take account of this when we consider rulers as well. It's not because the rulers love the people that they rule, it's because they love themselves and they're looking after themselves. But Socrates disagrees with this take on things. He says that rulers don't rule willingly, at least the good ones, because they know that ruling will benefit their subjects rather than themselves. This is why rulers demand wages to compensate for the time they spend ruling, because otherwise they don't benefit. The craft of ruling, or of shepherding, does not generate wages itself. This is instead the role of a separate craft called wage earning, which runs alongside. The only reason why good people rule is because the alternative is to be ruled by somebody who's worse than them. Thrasymachus thinks this is silly. He says that just people always end up being worse off than unjust people, and therefore being unjust is a sign of good judgment. However, Socrates observes that some unjust acts require a bare minimum level of justice in order to work, and that this makes justice more powerful. For example, a gang of thieves has to trust each other, and they have to work together in order to be successful at stealing. Socrates also gives another argument regarding functions and virtue. He says that a thing's function is that which it does best. Each thing which has a function has a virtue, and without this virtue, it could not perform the function well. Now, the function of the soul, according to Socrates, includes ruling, taking care of things, deliberating, and living. Without virtue, the soul cannot perform these things well. Socrates says that the virtue of the soul, which allows it to fill its function well, is justice, and that injustice is the vice that prevents this, and he goes on to explore these ideas more in Book 2 of the Republic. Therefore, a just person lives well and is happy, in contrast to what Thrasymachus is suggesting. Finally, Thrasymachus argues back that just people are ignorant, while unjust people are clever and good. Socrates retorts that just people want to outdo people who are unlike them, i.e. unjust people, whereas unjust people want to just outdo everybody. He says that in all crafts, a knowledgeable person only wants to outdo those who are unlike him, whereas an ignorant person just wants to outdo everybody. He therefore concludes that the opposite of what Thrasymachus just said must be true, i.e. it must be the case that just people are clever and good, while unjust people are ignorant and bad. Now, after all of this argumentation, we might expect that Socrates would be pleased that he appears to have won the argument on justice here. However, the conclusion of the book is the opposite. Socrates is unsatisfied because he notices that he never actually finished deliberating what justice is. So he's been arguing for and against a certain view of justice without discussing justice itself. This is a topic that he will continue to discuss and debate in the following book and throughout the entire rest of the Republic. This is a detailed summary of the arguments of the first book. You can now probably see the kind of argument style that's being pursued and how Socrates argues his point and counter-argues against the other characters involved. It's also clear how he builds up an argument little by little to come to his conclusion. So, for example, let's take that last argument again, which is made in response to Thrasymachus' claim that unjust people are clever and good. Socrates' response has two main premises. Premise 1. Just people want to outdo people who are unlike them, whereas unjust people want to outdo everyone. Premise 2. In all crafts, a knowledgeable person only wants to outdo those who are unlike him, whereas an ignorant person wants to outdo everyone. The conclusion of the argument, then, is that just people must be clever and good, and unjust people are ignorant and bad. We can see that if the premises of that argument, as Socrates lays them out, are true, then his conclusion must follow. Now let's go on to have a look at some questions regarding the first book of Plato's Republic. The questions are, what is Thrasymachus' definition of justice, and is Socrates' response satisfactory? To answer any question in philosophy, we have to be critical on every level, including towards the question itself. At first glance, it might seem simple what Thrasymachus' definition of justice is, because he stated quite explicitly that it's the advantage of the stronger. However, it's not so clear after all, because some of the points that Thrasymachus goes on to argue contradicts this, or might suggest that an alternative definition is the case. The Plato scholar C.D.C. Reeve argues that there are three main opinions as to what the definition could be. A. That justice is the advantage of the stronger or ruler. B. That justice is the good of another. Or C. That justice is obedience to the law. Now, where's the evidence in the text for each of these different definitions? Well, for A, it's clear because Thrasymachus himself explicitly says that justice is the advantage of the stronger. But B is also possible because Thrasymachus talks about justice not benefiting oneself, but rather benefiting someone else. In the case of C, Socrates points out that it still seems to be just to follow laws, even if they accidentally turn against the fortune of the ruler, which is where this idea comes from. Now, some points we have to consider here include whether Thrasymachus himself may contradict his own view at some points, therefore complicating his own definition of justice, or whether Thrasymachus' definition may deliberately incorporate elements of A, B, and C. We need to also consider where the rulers themselves sit in relation to the definition. Now, in terms of this last point, we have to consider that justice as defined as the advantage of somebody else means that the rulers have to be excluded from this definition somehow. Because if justice is the advantage of someone else, but the rulers are benefiting from justice, then the rulers don't fit into this definition. With regards to whether Socrates' response is satisfactory, we have to consider what exactly Socrates was trying to achieve through his arguments in this book. Was he trying to defeat Thrasymachus' definition? Or maybe provide an alternative definition to Thrasymachus? Or maybe he was criticizing certain argumentation methods that were being employed. The conclusion of the book, that Socrates is unsatisfied by his own arguments, leads us to reflect carefully back on the text. We have to ask ourselves which of Socrates' arguments were strong and which seemed more questionable. So, for example, what did you think about the argument that wage earning is a separate craft practiced by all craftsmen that explains why their attention is actually on the object of the craft itself? Do you think that this idea fits well with reality? Are we convinced that wage earning is a real craft that every single craftsman practices and perfects? Reeve argues that Socrates' real aim here is to show that the analogy between craft and justice is not strong enough to prove what he wants to prove about justice later on in the Republic. Therefore, Socrates' counter-argument is possibly more an exercise in discarding his own approach rather than an attempt to show how justice is a kind of craft. This is supported by the fact that Socrates does not apply the same logic in later books. He doesn't use the craft analogy again to try and illuminate an idea of justice. The Plato scholar Barney proposes that Plato deliberately sets Socrates up to fail in some ways in this first book, in order to encourage a change of methodological approach from that point on. Socrates appears to have overcome Thrasymachus' arguments through counterexamples in this first book, but he has not given enough information actively himself to give his own definition of justice at this point. When he begins to contemplate justice again in later books, he uses a different approach. It may therefore be that Socrates' response was perfectly satisfactory for the aims he was trying to achieve, even if it has not left us with much idea as to what justice is by the end of the book. As we have seen throughout this session, studying Plato is not about learning what Plato said and memorizing his wise words. Studying Plato, just like when we study any philosopher, or any other scholar for that matter, requires a great deal of critical thinking. Philosophy is an exercise in learning how to think. It's important to reflect on how arguments are constructed, where the evidence comes from to justify points, and whether the person writing the argument has any vested interests that may bias the argument in a certain direction. Now, this goes for all topics in philosophy. If we're studying Aristotle, or philosophy of religion, or looking at different thought experiments, we have to understand what is going on in terms of conflicting concepts and how we might be able to resolve this. This often requires us to look at things from a different angle and to be highly self-reflective and critical. Studying the works of thinkers like Plato can give us insight into human thought and into how best to reflect. So when you next find yourself having a discussion with friends or watching a debate between politicians, try having a think about where each person is coming from, their argument style, and where they're getting their evidence from. And you may find that the reflections you have carried out today on Plato help you to understand the mechanics of the situation on a meta level.